Good morning, everybody. My name is Anup Pandevadekar. I'm the Passenger Vehicle Program Director and India lead for ICCT. And this is the second in a series of webinars we are trying to organize this year. Today's topic is on ride-hailing vehicle electrification. If you attended the last webinar last month, which was on two-wheeler fuel efficiency standards, I promise that we will actually focus more on two-wheeler cost parity this month. But unfortunately, like many of you, we've had colleagues who got affected by COVID, and so we haven't been quite able to finish that paper yet. So hopefully we'll do that next month, and we'll bring back that webinar on two-wheeler electrification cost parity at a later date. But in the meanwhile, today we've got a topic that we previously discussed and are now revisiting on electrification of ride-hailing vehicles in India. I've got two colleagues who will do the presentation. So Nivedita Dash, she's based in Bangalore, and she'll present the first part of this presentation. And then my colleague Sandra Wappelhurst, who's based in Berlin, will take over the second half. I think we have a relatively small group of people, so we should be able to unmute and take questions if that makes sense. But feel free to ask or type in your questions using the question pane you have on your GoToWebinar control panel. Or post it in a chat if that's required, and we'll take those questions either by unmuting you or reading out to the audience and get them answered that way, and go from there. So just like every webinar, we will put up a recording of the webinar and the slides on the web. So recording and slides from last month's webinar are now online. And similarly, this slides will be available to everybody online along with the recording. So you don't need to worry about that. But so feel free to ask any other questions as we go ahead. But let me turn it over to Nivedita.
Hi, thank you, Anup. Hi, everybody. So as Anup mentioned, we'll be presenting the analysis of policies for electrifying India's four-wheeler ride-hailing fleet. And we'll just directly jump to the presentation. So why is electrification needed for India? 21 of the 30 most polluted cities in the world are from India. And pollution costs us 3.31 lakh per second. So India stands a lot by converting its ICE vehicles to electric vehicles. And a recent study by WBCSD in 2019 has shown that 100% electrification in India by 2030 can actually reduce the carbon dioxide emissions by 51%. Hence, given India's ride-hailing to be growing at 19% of compound annual growth rate, of course, presently offset by COVID-19, but probably there could be a mid and a long-term growth in near future, seeing that India stands a lot to achieve by electrifying its ride-hailing fleet. And it's crucial for India's achieving the EV mission. So with this background, we basically draw upon the cost parity analysis of the BEVs or the battery electric vehicles in compared to our ICE vehicles. So this is just to give you a quick background. This is the updated study, or the similar study was done in 2019, and we performed the same study for 2020. And we discussed the results and what is the agenda as we move forward. So the basic agenda of the agenda of our discussion is divided into primarily two parts. First is the analysis of the fiscal incentives on the TCO of electric cars, which we have divided into the baseline scenario analysis, where we analyze the cost of ownership over 5 years for BEVs uh, under the central government or the state government policies that apply for 2020. Next, we compare these results from 2020 to 2019, and then we go further to analyze further additional policies that could actually have an impact on bringing down the cost difference, if any, between the BEV and the ICE vehicles. And further, we shared the policy recommendations or the findings from our analysis. And as mentioned by Anu, the second part of our analysis is on the non-fiscal policies to drive adoption of EVs in India, which will be discussed by Sandra. So we jump to the first part of our analysis, which is basically the fiscal analysis. And here we have developed the research methodology, which is divided into two parts. First is baseline scenario and the hypothetical scenario. As mentioned previously, in the baseline scenario, we assess the or evaluate the cost of ownership for 5 years, over 5-year holding period of the vehicle. And the cities we select for these are Delhi, Hyderabad, and Bangalore. And the vehicle models that we select, as you see in the first box here, are used or have the potential to be used in ride-hailing fleet. Tata Nexon is something that is presently not used in the ride-hailing fleet, but probably it has, as the number of vehicles or the number of models that we see in India, 8 total presently, 8 models that are available. Among them, Tata Nexon has a pretty good specification in terms of being used as ride hailing. So next, what we do is compare these results to 2019 for select cities of Hyderabad and Delhi, because these are the same cities which were taken for 2019. And for these, the models are also kept same as 2019. Next, we go to the additional policy analysis, which are done for the 3 cities of Delhi, Hyderabad, and Bangalore, as we had taken for 2020 baseline scenario. And the vehicle models selected are both the BEVs and the CNG, which is the vehicle, ICE vehicle we see is still cheaper than BEV. And the fourth part, as we mentioned previously, just to reiterate, will be the non-fiscal policy analysis. So coming down to the first part of our analysis, the baseline, first part of our fiscal analysis, the baseline scenario analysis, where I'll run you through very quickly through few key assumptions that we have taken towards assessing the total cost of ownership. First is the purchased cost assumption. So the purchase costs are mainly based on the ex-showroom prices of the vehicles across 3 cities, the details of which you can find in the paper shared in the source below. And the interest rate for BEVs here is 0.2% less than the conventional car as per India's green loans. Finance cost is estimated based on a 5-year loan with a 15% down payment. And the purchase incentives which apply to the BEVs are FAME2 from the central government of India. Second is the upfront purchase incentive from Delhi government, notified in 2020, as recently as 2020. And however, we see that there are no purchase incentives which are available from the state governments of Telangana and Karnataka. The next key assumption is on taxes, fees, and insurance. Mainly the taxes we have considered is one-time goods and service tax, the GST at 28% for ICE vehicles and 5% for BEVs. Compensation cess at 1%, and tax collected at source for vehicles costing more than 10 lakhs, which is at 0.75% for most of the vehicles. And GST for BEVs, of course, is lesser, as I mentioned, than the conventional vehicles. And BEVs are also exempted from the registration fee and road tax in all the 3 cities. And for the insurance component of our TCO, we take the 3 mandatory insurances, that is third party, personal accident cover, and own damage cover. And today, at present, the third party cover damage is discounted for private EV owners. However, it is not waived for commercial cars, commercial electric vehicles, basically. So those are the first 2 assumptions, first 2 parts. And the next one is on the fueling and the refueling. The fueling for the ICE vehicles, we take a 6-month average, because we identified taking a single day average would not give us the exact value that actually trends over a certain time. So to remove such anomalies, we have actually taken a 6-month average for the 3 cities and a 25% increase over the certified fuel efficiency value to give a real check on the fuel efficiency value of the cars. And for the BEVs, we have taken for the charging for the charging uh, times, we have taken a overnight one charging event for BEV Nexon and Mahindra eVerito D2, and the rest of it is public charging as per demand. The refueling for ICE vehicles are, as mentioned, 5 minutes, and for CNG 30 minutes, taken again from literature, different literature, and also the practical values that comes for this. And for the BEVs, it's 68 minutes on an average, and for Mahindra eVerito G2, it's 101 minutes for full charging of the electric vehicle. And the wages that we took for the different type of cars, sedan and compact, is 112 and 89 INR per hour. We are assuming a vehicle utilization of 200 kilometers per day with 317 working days and 12-hour work day per day. So based on these all of those assumptions, we try to ascertain the TCO, and what we see is the TCO for BEV adoption in ride hailing is getting competitive in India, especially in case of city of Delhi, which we have put here. We see that the BEV Nexon and Mahindra eVerito D2 cost way less than the gasoline and diesel, while CNG remains the cheapest among all the 5 vehicles. And the lesser cost or the deduction in cost is due to mainly the FAME 2 and the Delhi EV policy that is applicable in Delhi, which brings down the total cost of ownership for the Nexon and the eVerito D2. But the challenges to adoption still remains, which are the high vehicle upfront cost, which are indicated by values in the bracket for Nexon and eVerito D2, a high vehicle finance cost, which together we depict in the brown bar in the figure alongside, and a high opportunity cost of loss due to business, which is basically the potential revenue that the driver would have earned while charging his vehicle during the working hours, which is high actually for Mahindra eVerito D2 because it has a higher charging time of 101 minutes and 68 minutes. So Mahindra eVerito D2 occurs a higher opportunity cost loss. And if we see in the other cities, we also see the same trend that follows. The challenges to adoption remains similar to that of Delhi. And the cost also is almost similar to gasoline and diesel, ranging the cost per kilometer along the vertical axis on right hand side almost shows it is around 7.2 for both the BEVs compared to gasoline or diesel, and CNG still remains cheaper. So here the impact is, here the TCO is not reduced due to not unavailability of the state incentives from for Hyderabad, unlike Delhi. And so Bangalore also has the same trend, follows like Hyderabad, the same challenges, and the TCO for both the vehicles are almost same as gasoline and diesel. So once we have assessed the TCO of the BEVs, we now compare it to what change we see from 2019. And as I mentioned previously, we keep the two vehicles same, that is Mahindra eVerito D2 for both the years because those are the same vehicles that were taken for analysis. So we keep it consistent. And we see there's a 34% drop in the total cost of ownership in 1 year, primarily due to 3 reasons. One is the drop in vehicle price itself, which drops 26% in 1 year over in Delhi. And second is the FAME 2 incentive and the state EV policy. Whereas compared to the gasoline vehicle, which has a 5% increase, primarily due to increase in fuel cost. The same trend is also seen in Hyderabad, but here the two factors, but the drop is lesser than Delhi because of the absence of, again, the state incentive, which is not applicable here. So the baseline scenario, basically we sum up as BEVs are actually getting competitive to both the diesel and the gasoline in terms of TCO. So what we basically conclude from our baseline analysis is, with the current cost and incentive structures in place, BEVs are either getting as costly as or cheaper than diesel and gasoline. As we see in case of Delhi, they are getting cheaper, whereas in case of the other two cities, Hyderabad and Bangalore, it's almost same as diesel and gasoline over a 5-year holding period. And if we revisit those slides, we see that the upfront cost and the finance cost for BEVs are still more expensive than the conventional cars. However, the CNGs are still the cheapest among all the vehicles, in spite of the incentives that we have for the BEV car models. So what we do next is, as a next part of our analysis, we try to analyze what are the additional policies that could actually bring down the cost difference between the BEV and the CNG cars. Before we run through the results, I'll run you through a few of the key assumptions that we took for the hypothetical additional policy scenario, which is basically first in terms of the deployment of DC fast charger infrastructure at 50 kilowatt. Presently, India's standardized charging infrastructure is 15 kilowatt, which is way lesser than those in US and Europe, which have a higher standard for DC charging. And hence we try to see the impact of what this would have on bringing down the total cost of ownership for BEVs. Next, we see that what is the impact of FAME to incentive on Hyderabad and Bangalore, similar to that is applicable in Delhi today. The third one is the interest rate subvention on the electric vehicle loans, which we take at 5%. This is something that is applicable today for three-wheelers and autos in Delhi. And so we try to assess what would be its impact on four-wheelers in India. In case of four-wheelers in these Indian cities. And the tax collected at source, which is today at 0.75% for all the vehicles. So we see what would be its impact on exempting this. The discount on IRDAI, as I previously mentioned, is the third-party discount is waived for or discounted for electric private owners, but not for the commercial owners. So we try to see if it is a commercial vehicle, what would be its impact. And the other ones that we take is parking fee waiver, rebates on trip taken to electric vehicle ride-hailing cab, which is something similar to Uber London, that pays the Uber driver a certain amount for taking a ride-hailing trip, which we take as INR 5 per trip. And another one is the bulk purchase, something similar that had been given to CNG drivers in Delhi in 2015 for transiting converting their vehicles to CNG or adopting CNG basically. And the opportunity cost rebate to the electric drivers, basically this is something the aggregators would give to compensate the driver for the time loss or the opportunity loss during charging his vehicle. So based on all of these key assumptions that we take here, we try to model what would be its impact in bringing down the TCO or cost per kilometer, TCO per kilometer between the BEV and the CNG, which still we saw in baseline scenario has a cost difference. So the first policy that we see actually has a significant impact on bringing down the cost is the central purchase incentive matched by the state funding. And here we have done analysis for all the three cities for both the BEVs, but I have only put up the results for Tata Nexon for Hyderabad because Tata Nexon is a higher cost vehicles with a higher upfront cost, and hence the impact of this incentive is quite significant in bringing down the cost, shown by the dotted line here, dotted red line that shows the impact. So basically, how do we see this graph? The brown bar is basically the TCO delta between Nexon and CNG before the applying these additional incentives or additional policies. And the blue bars basically reflect the incremental impact of these additional policies and resulting in the TCO delta, which is achieved after application of these incremental incentives, after these incremental incentives. And we see the TCO delta between Nexon and CNG reduces by 0.68, minus 0.68. That is basically the Tata Nexon becomes way cheaper than CNG. So Next recommendation or finding that came out from our additional policy analysis is the investment in fast charging infrastructure has a impact on reducing the opportunity cost and motivate drivers to transition to BEVs. And here we see the impact in case of eVerito D2. Again, why I took eVerito D2 displayed it is because it has a higher charging time of 101 minutes, and application of DC fast charging actually brings down the charging time, the full charging time, to 36 minutes. So the impact is quite visible, and lesser charging time means incurring lesser opportunity, I mean losing lesser potential revenue that he would have earned during those hours. So we see that the BEVs that has a higher charging time, a DC investment on a DC fast charging can have a potential impact in bringing down the opportunity cost. And we see here that Mahindra eVerito D2 becomes cheaper than the Maruti CNG 2RES by the cost delta reduces by 1.34, that is, it becomes cheaper than the CNG. And the last one that we see is the waiver on the annual interest payment towards loans taken for electric vehicle purchase. If we may recall, the third challenge that we saw in the baseline scenario is higher finance cost, which is actually brought down by or eliminated by the waiver on the interest rate, as we see here. And here also we took the Tata Nexon because that has a higher upfront cost, meaning that that requires a higher finance, and the impact of the waiver on the loans shows a considerable impact on its finance cost. And here, though the does not become really cheaper than CNG, but at least the cost reduces significantly, the cost difference between these two vehicles in terms of TCO per kilometer, which we see is actually 1.62 as reflected in the brown bar. But if we come down to the red bar, we see the cost difference becomes now 0.41. So which is a good in terms of reducing the cost difference between these two vehicles. So to sum up the findings from our additional policy analysis, basically we see that BEVs are getting competitive to CNG cars in terms of the total cost of ownership. And we see the three impactful additional incentives that can actually bring down the cost difference between them is the state incentives of same value as FAME 2, which can bridge the gap between the BEV and the CNG, a discount on the interest rate that could bring down the vehicle finance cost, which is a significant component of the procurement cost, as we saw in the baseline cases, and the fast charger technology deployment, which could further reduce the cost difference and thus have a lesser opportunity cost. So this is the end of the financial incentives or the policy analysis that we performed to see how BEVs are getting cost competitive to ICE, and with further additional fiscal incentives, it could further bring down the cost that exists between BEVs and the CNG in this case. Thank you.
Thanks, Nivedita. There is at least one question that may be worth taking at this time, and more questions may come, and we can discuss them at the end. And if you've got a questions, feel free to type it into the questions pane or raise your hand, and we can try and unmute you. So this question is from Falgun Patel, and I'm going to try and unmute you, Falgun, so you can ask your question.
Sure.
So go ahead and bring it up.
Sure.
So we have tried to see, yes, Anup? So we have tried to see basically what is the impact of each of these. I mean, when we model all of these together, what is the impact or highest impact that we see in case of the vehicles? And specifically here, if we see in case of Tata Nexon, this definitely what you say is correct in terms of, since it has a lower charging time of average charging time of 68 minutes, both of these the impact of both of these incentives cancel out each other, or they are almost same. Whereas if you see in case of Mahindra, a lower costing EV, then we see that the 50 kilowatt charger has a more impact than the aggregator incentive, which is reflected in case of eVerito D2. So does this answer your question?
So, Nivedita, I mean, I think the question was, does the availability of fast charger essentially result in proportionally smaller aggregator incentive? Is that accounted for in your analysis or not? So, I mean, if I understood, Falgun, your question, you're right in some sense that the aggregator incentive is there to compensate the drivers for some of this lost time in a way, but that depends on what the aggregators' motivations are. And I mean, we should take it in the second half of it that we really think that there are other reasons as to why an aggregator may want to provide incentive beyond just covering the opportunity cost, and in particular, motivated by regulatory means, that the aggregator could give incentive to its driver partners to move towards electric vehicles as opposed to continuing to ride IC. So we'll touch upon that there. But if your answer, like question, is more narrowly as to if it's only about interaction between these two incentives, then I don't think it's quite covered here.
Yeah, I think not necessarily in terms of we are looking at the interplay of these two, as you mentioned, but we are probably looking more in terms of what would be the effect of each of these individual in terms of individual additional policy in terms of bringing down the cost, not exactly at the interplay of it.
Okay, so right now there isn't another question, so we can move to the second half. So over to you, Sandra.
Okay. Yes. Please move over to the next slide. So we have also been working on another paper, which will be published in due course. And this paper focuses on non-fiscal policies adopted by national, state, local governments in India and outside India, helping to spur the electrification of ride-hailing fleets. For that, we have been looking at the major ride-hailing markets by revenue, such as China, the United States, Europe, and also India. And this slide shows revenues from ride-hailing and taxi fleets in those markets. And China was leading in 2020 with the highest revenues generated from the ride-hailing and taxi segment, followed by the United States, Europe, and India. This slide shows some of the commitments by major ride-hailing companies in these four markets to electrify their fleets and only allow zero-emission cars on their platforms in future years. The focus here is on commitments towards the electrification of four-wheeler ride-hailing fleets. In the United States, shown in red, Uber and Lyft have committed to have 100% electric vehicles in their fleet by 2030. In China, Didi is aiming for 10 million electric vehicles by 2028. And in Europe, Uber targets 100% electric ride-hailing vehicles in their fleet by 2030, similar to the United States. There are also commitments by Uber for specific cities, that means at city level, such as in Amsterdam, Berlin, Brussels, Lisbon, London, Madrid, and Paris, to electrify 50% of their fleet by 2025 in these cities. And when we look at India, Uber and Ola, the major ride-hailing companies here, have not made any commitments for four-wheeler ride-hailing vehicles so far. That means to electrify those fleets. But for the other markets, these commitments by the major ride-hailing companies are largely driven by policy actions of the respective national, state, and local governments. And as said, we will highlight some of these non-monetary policies in the following slides. This slide shows example policy actions by national, state, and local governments in China, the United States, and Europe, which are specifically targeted at the electrification of ride-hailing fleets. The first measure are electrification goals and strategies for ride-hailing companies. At a national level, France has required in 2015 already by law that 10% of new ride-hailing and taxi vehicles must be low emission by 2020. That means emitting no more than 60 grams CO2 per kilometer. So effectively, they have to be BEVs or plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. And at local levels, several cities in China have adopted targets to electrify their respective ride-hailing fleets. For example, the city of Shenzhen requires ride-hailing fleets to be 100% electric by the end of 2021. Another measure, the second point, are emission standards, specifically aiming at ride-hailing fleets. One example is the state of California in the United States, which a few days ago adopted its Clean Miles Standard. And the Clean Miles Standard sets targets for greenhouse gas emission and electric vehicle miles traveled for transport network companies such as Uber and Lyft, along with increasing electrification targets. The Clean Miles Standard requires ride-hailing companies in California to achieve a level of 0 greenhouse gas emission and ensure that 90% of their vehicle miles are fully electric by 2030. The third point, very specific, at Seattle Airport in the United States, where green standards for ride-hailing companies have been introduced. And the last point are licensing requirements for ride-hailing companies. So for example, in London, ride-hailing vehicles must be electric. That means BEVs or plug-in hybrid vehicles. If they're under 18 months old when licensed for the first time, and from 2023, all ride-hailing vehicles licensed for the first time must be electric vehicles in order to do their business in the city. Of course, there are additional non-fiscal policies that help to spur the electrification of the entire passenger car fleet, which also includes ride-hailing vehicles. So the first point are phase out targets to end the sale or registration of new combustion engine vehicles and only allow new sales or registrations of electric vehicles. So they have been recently an increasing number of countries and states that are committed to end the sale of ICE vehicles, and they are mostly in North America and Europe. And for India, a similar phase out targets is still pending. The second point are zero emission vehicle regulations. So one way to implement those phase out targets are regulations or zero emission vehicle regulations. So the Canadian province of British Columbia has adopted a regulation that requires automakers to only sell zero-emission cars by 2040. California is working on a similar regulation. And so this is at state levels and at national levels. One example is China's new energy vehicle mandate, which requires each vehicle manufacturer and importer to make or import at least 20% electric vehicles. That means BEVs and PHEVs in 2025. The third non-monetary measure listed here is labeling of electric vehicles. So some countries or states have introduced special number plates or stickers for vehicles. And with these stickers, you can also identify electric vehicles. And these labels or stickers can help local governments to implement policies to incentivize electric vehicle drivers. And these measures could be preferred access to restricted areas such as congestion charging zones or low emission zones, or also parking benefits. You can find these kind of labels in countries such as France, Germany, Spain, United Kingdom, and also California, and they also introduced relevant benefits for electric vehicles. And as mentioned, low emission zones or other forms of urban vehicle access regulations, here the fourth point, can also push consumers towards electric vehicles. Because if they are not able to drive in certain parts of a city or the entire city, then also ride-hailing companies or drivers cannot make their business any longer. So cities like Amsterdam and Paris are planning to only allow zero-emission vehicles to drive in their cities in future years, which can also explain why Uber has set electrification targets for these cities. So instead of not electrifying their fleets, Uber or their drivers using the platform won't be able to drive in those cities in the future if not moving to electric vehicles. And finally, a license plate access. So in Beijing, in China, for example, the time for obtaining a license plate for electric vehicles are much shorter, so about a few months, while it takes years for obtaining a license plate for a new conventional vehicle. So to sum it up, there are some non-fiscal measures which have been adopted outside India to spur the electrification of the passenger car fleet overall, but also of ride-hailing fleets specifically. Moving back to India, here's some example non-fiscal policies that have been taken towards the electrification of the country's vehicle fleet. So specifically targeted at ride-hailing companies is setting targets for the uptake of zero-emission vehicles in shared mobility services. This has been notified by the central government of India to all states. However, there are no time-based targets for inducting zero-emission vehicles that have been specified by the central government, and as a result, there is no effect of this policy measure on ground. The second point, electrification targets in the motor vehicles aggregators guideline. The guideline was released by the central government in November 2020. However, it does not specify anything about the electrification of four-wheeler ride-hailing vehicles, which can also be considered as a missed opportunity so far. And then again, policies for the electrification of the entire passenger car fleet. Some are listed here. So one are CO2 emission standards for passenger cars. They are existent in India, but when we compare the development in Europe, and what happened with the electric vehicle market last year, we see that the introduction of tighter CO2 emission standards in Europe, or by the European Union in 2020, has helped to spur the electric vehicle market. So while in 2019, 3% of new passenger car registrations were electric, in Europe, it increased to 11% in 2020, which was largely driven by tighter CO2 emission standards for passenger cars introduced in the beginning of 2020. And whereas in India, under the current CO2 regulation, manufacturers are not pushed enough to deploy electric vehicles in the market. And when we look at electric cars for sale in India current, there are less than 10 models available. And in comparison, for example, in Germany in 2020, about 170 different BEV and PHEV models were newly registered. So outside India, European, US markets, China, we find a much larger model choice, which also helps to drive business in the ride-hailing market. Another policy option to drive the electrification in India's entire passenger car fleet is green tax exemptions for battery electric vehicles in the central government's upcoming vehicle scrappage policy. This scrappage policy is not in effect yet. And also in the draft policy, there is no mechanism linking scrappage of conventional vehicles and replacing it with battery electric vehicles. The next point are green card registration plate with yellow font. This has also been notified by the central government of India to all states, and this has been implemented. However, there are no benefits like priority parking, waiver on toll fees, or parking fees passed on to electric vehicle drivers by the state and local governments so far. A last measure are exemptions of electric vehicles from the permit requirement for applying as transport vehicles. This has also been notified by the central government to all states. However, state governments have not stopped asking for permits from electric transport vehicles. So overall in India, if looking at non-monetary policy measures, there are a couple of placed and implemented, but for the others, they have not been implemented yet or linked to benefits for electric vehicles in general or electric ride-hailing cars specifically. So to move to the conclusions based on the analysis of the total cost of ownership, adopted fiscal policies, additional policies that could help to increase the cost benefit for electric vehicles over combustion engine vehicles in ride-hailing fleets, and non-fiscal policy options, we would like to highlight the following points. So first, and this refers to the entire passenger car fleet, which is then also of benefit for electrifying ride-hailing fleets. One option, as said before, are regulations such as CO2 emission standards or zero-emission vehicle regulations that help to ensure investment by car manufacturers and thereby also help to increase the model availability of electric cars and also model choice. as said, at current, there are just a few electric vehicle models available on the Indian market. Second point are we have seen that fiscal incentives are important to make electric vehicles cost attractive towards combustion engine cars, particularly at car purchase, which also helps ride-hailing drivers. Charging infrastructure, particularly fast charging opportunities, also important to guarantee that electric vehicle drivers and also those of ride-hailing cars can fulfill their business without losing time and money when doing their business. And not in existence so far, the last point, cities also play an important role in the electrification of the entire vehicle fleet, and particularly or specifically of ride-hailing fleets. And we see in Europe that restrictions as low emission zones or congestion charges, which are not in place in India yet, help to increase the share of electric vehicles, and also are a push for drivers, but also ride-hailing aggregators to switch to electric vehicles. So I'm almost through. Specifically for the electrification of ride-hailing fleets, there can also be regulations such as clean miles standards in California, which sets emission standards for these fleets. Important are certainly also relevant targets for ride-hailing companies in terms of electrification shares by a certain date, to also help to implement the relevant fiscal and non-fiscal policies to reach these goals. And a last measure I want to highlight here are licensing requirements as adopted, for example, in London, that only allow those to make business who own and drive an electric vehicle. So overall, our analysis and example from countries, states, and local governments outside India shows that it requires the Indian government a system of regulation, fiscal and non-fiscal policies, charging infrastructure, local actions to also drive the electrification of the four-wheeler ride-hailing fleet. And as a last point to highlight, we did focus here in the presentation on governmental actions. Of course, there are like the ride-hailing companies are working with car manufacturers and energy providers to get the relevant vehicles and also charging infrastructure. But again, here the focus was on governmental activities. And the last slide to finalize was a quote from a ride-hailing commuter. Next slide, please. Is glad that riding an environment-friendly electric car is possible today at the same cost of ride-hailing the fossil fuel cars. It is a win-win for commuters as they get to contribute their part in cleaner cities. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Sandra. We have at least one question from Nishant Vas. So I'm going to unmute Nishant. He's got a two-part question, really. But let's let him ask his question. So Nishant, if you can go ahead.
Yeah, hi. So I think thanks for the presentation.
Sure. Let me take the second question first, and then hand it back to Nivedita or Sandra for the first one. So, I mean, Nishant, the way I would say is, as we are working on estimating upfront cost parity, not just TCO cost parity for two-wheelers and four-wheelers in India, we are making an explicit assumption that batteries for electric vehicles in India will be made in India. And at that kind of, with that particular assumption, we actually don't see costs coming down at the kind of $100 per kilowatt hour well into later half of this decade. Roughly, it's a 4 to 5 year lag, assuming we start today. And quite honestly, we aren't starting today in India in terms of building battery plants at scale. So the actual timelines for made in India batteries costing $100 per kilowatt hour might be a little bit further away than what the global averages suggest. In part, it's a chicken and egg problem that why should anybody invest a lot of money in making batteries at very large scale in India if there is no guarantee of demand in other markets of the world, whether it's European Union, whether it's California, whether it's China. Manufacturers have invested heavily in battery electric vehicles, and battery suppliers have come on board at scale, largely because of these regulatory targets, whether through CO2 standards or zero emission vehicle targets. Because these targets are absent in India at present, we think there is still a pretty good possibility that even though the TCO parity is reached by 2025, 2026 timeframe without incentives in India, the actual market deployment numbers may be quite small. And you see that, in India, 50% of car market is Maruti Suzuki controlled, and they are not in any hurry to introduce an EV in India at present, and perhaps not for quite some time to come. And they are unlikely to do so unless a regulatory target requires them to do that. So I don't think we're really conservative in that sense. I think we are sort of we'll change the assumption about deployment in personal passenger vehicles if the regulations tighten. So I think that I'll sort of leave it at that. But the first question, Nivedita or Sandra, if you want to take, part of this is, again, you answered in Sandra's question, like Sandra's presentation about that. Nishant's question really is, hey, look, the existing driver partners are already, taking up loans to buy their ICE vehicles, and it's not so easy for them to make, a lot of money. This is not a very lucrative job. So what makes us think that, this new EV fleet transition can happen on ride-hailing front? So either of you want to address that?
Yeah, I can say something to that. So that goes a bit in the direction what Arno was saying. So first of all, India is one of the largest passenger car markets, and they also have local car manufacturers. And if they want to keep in pace with the other larger passenger car markets by sales, like United States, China, Germany, also from the economic perspective, then this is the way, then this should be the way forward, even if Maruti Suzuki, for example, is not making any movement at current. But we have seen from the other vehicle manufacturers in the recent past that they were also reluctant at first, but now we have more and more vehicle manufacturers also committing to increase the share or only sell electric vehicles in future years to come. Like a couple of years or 3 years ago, this was also kind of out of reach. And this is also happening as more and more governments are setting regulations, committing to phase out electric vehicles at local levels. Like I said, in Paris or London, if Uber, for them, these are large markets. And so they are adapting to the policies in order to continue making business in these cities. And so this is, I'm convinced that this is happening in India at some point as well, largely driven also by policies and commitment, and to also maintain the economic wealth of the country.
Thank you.
And to add,
sure.
Sorry, go ahead. No, I wanted to.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, so just to add to Sandra's point, the question that you had in terms of the how economically viable is it for the drivers who are already saddled with loans. So we have also seen the change in terms of drivers being given a discount, a bulk, not discount, but a bulk purchase for converting to CNGs, right? That was in 2015 probably. So probably that is something is what we require in terms of a kind of directive from authorities that help them probably push towards electrification. So at that point of time, they were actually not changing to CNG on their own or willingly, and a bulk purchase was given to them based on a court order to convert to CNG. So we also see that probably something similar could actually push them towards electrification, and as probably more models come into the market that reasonable cost range and the prices decrease, probably that could be the way forward.
Thanks, team. Thanks for those clarifications. Anup, if I may just check for you for a small clarification, when you meant about the cost structure, are you also assuming like the advanced cell chemistry incentive scheme that most people globally, including BNEF, have mentioned to be quite good? That would not see major offtake because that has the exports outlook as well from a manufacturing setup, not just domestic demand. If any thoughts on that, please.
Correct. Yeah, no, the ACC PLI scheme is, of course, very attractive. I mean, it's roughly $25 or so per kilowatt hour. I mean, that's a pretty significant incentive for these battery production to happen. So that's not really a problem, I mean, as far as policy goes, and it will incentivize at least some production capacity to be set up in India. But as we've been dealing with the economy of scale of battery making operations, we are at least, I mean, actually assuming that India's domestic production capacity at least needs to be, you know, let's say where the US was 3 or 4 years ago, in order for it to start generating some of those economies of scale. And so the longer we take in terms of getting these things off the ground, the longer sort of it takes for us to get to the economy of scale. And so I think the only caution I think I would advise here is to not take the global, or which are largely sort of China-based sales weighted averages from BNEF survey and apply them. Now, one caveat I would say, and I think, you know, we've not verified this ourselves, but I think, you know, BNEF has made that estimate that the capital cost of setting up a similar sized battery plant is going to be lower in India. And we've not been able to verify the basis for that kind of an assumption. But the BNEF estimates India to be one of the lowest cost, capital cost countries for a battery manufacturing plants. And if that is correct, then maybe our assumptions could be pulled forward in time in terms of economies of scale and India's battery pack prices being consistent with global averages. But I think that's, still speculative at present. And so once the first plans under the ACC scheme go forward and we learn more about the kind of capital expenditure that is actually necessary in Indian context, then we'll have greater clarity on that front.
Thanks, Anup. Really appreciate it.
Okay, we are anyway past the hour. So thank you very much, all of you, for coming and joining. As I said, we will post the slides and recording online, and revisit some of these conversations going forward. So you should get an update on an email if you signed up for India mailing list. But we'll see you on one of these webinars, perhaps a month or 6 weeks from today. Thank you very much.